The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth as another shell exploded less than 50 yards from their position. Petty Officer Gavin Hollister's fingers trembled slightly against the Morse key, but his rhythm never faltered. Outside, the English Channel churned grey and violent as German E-boats sliced through the water toward the scattered patrol craft of His Majesty's coastal forces. 20 small vessels, fishing trawlers hastily converted for war, patrol boats with makeshift armour, all of them sitting ducks in the fog-shrouded waters off Dover, and all of them deaf to conventional radio transmissions. "They're jamming us again, sir," Hollister reported, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around their small radio station perched on the white cliffs. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Reginald Farley, peered through binoculars at the unfolding slaughter. Far below, the small Royal Navy patrol boats continued their regular patrol patterns, completely unaware of the German ambush force bearing down on them. A burst of signal light flashed from the lead British vessel, regular communication checks, standard procedure. But in the thickening morning fog of July 17, 1943, no one could see the signals. "How long before they're in position?" Farley asked, not lowering his binoculars. 4 minutes, sir. Perhaps 5. Hollister stared at his radio set, mind racing. Standard Morse was being jammed. The Germans had perfected their radio interference technology over the previous months, and during these morning fog conditions, their jamming was nearly perfect. Visual signals were useless in the fog. Sound carried poorly over the water's constant roar. And there, directly in his line of sight, 20 patrol boats filled with men, boys, most of them, were about to sail directly into a massacre. Hollister's eyes narrowed as he studied the radio dial. The Germans had become predictable in their jamming patterns, concentrating on key frequencies, sending bursts of static to obliterate any dots and dashes. He reached for the transmission dial, then hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls. No one in Coastal Command knew that for the past 6 months, Hollister had been experimenting with a modification to traditional Morse code transmission, a technique he'd conceived during long, lonely night watches, but had never dared implement. "Sir," he said quietly, "I need to try something unauthorized." No one in the 21st Coastal Forces Division knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite battlefield history, or that his shadow Morse would eventually save more lives than any single radio innovation of the entire European theatre. Gavin Hollister was born in the small coastal village of Whitby, Yorkshire, on May 18, 1917. His father, a fisherman who had served in the Royal Navy during the Great War, filled young Gavin's childhood with tales of naval battles and the wonder of wireless communication that had revolutionized warfare at sea. The family home sat perched on the cliffs overlooking the North Sea, and Gavin spent countless hours watching fishing vessels navigate the treacherous waters below. Learning to read the patterns of the waves and weather like others might read a book. At the age of 12, Gavin received his first crystal radio set as a birthday gift from his uncle, a telegraph operator for the postal service. While other boys played football or built model airplanes, Gavin sat for hours with headphones pressed against his ears, tuning into distant broadcasts from London, occasionally catching fragments of European transmissions when atmospheric conditions were favourable. He filled notebooks with codes and frequencies, developing an almost preternatural sense for the rhythm and cadence of Morse code. "The lad can hear a dot dash from halfway round the world," his father would boast to neighbours, though the claim was met with polite smiles and little understanding of Gavin's growing obsession. By 16, Gavin had built his own transmitter from salvaged parts and became one of the youngest licensed amateur radio operators in northern England. His modest station, operating under the call sign G2XH, became known among the ham radio community for its remarkably clear signal even during poor conditions. What few knew was that Gavin had developed his own modifications to standard transmission methods, experimenting with signal timing and frequency adjustments that seemed to cut through interference better than conventional techniques. "Radio waves are like ocean currents," he explained to his skeptical science teacher. "If you understand their patterns, you can navigate through the worst storms." The comparison to maritime navigation wasn't coincidental. Gavin had internalized his father's seafaring instincts and applied them to the invisible world of radio waves. Where others saw only static and interference, he perceived patterns and possibilities, gaps in the noise where a signal might slip through undetected. When war seemed inevitable in the late 1930s, Gavin volunteered for the Royal Navy, specifically requesting assignment to communications. His exceptional scores on the Morse aptitude tests, perfect reception at 35 words per minute, well above the 20 required for qualification, caught the attention of the Communications Training Division. Instead of serving aboard a ship as he'd expected, he was sent for specialized training at HMS Mercury, the Navy's signal school in Hampshire. "We need men who can do more than just tap out a message," his instructor, Lieutenant Wallace Morrison, told him. "We need operators who can think like the enemy, who can anticipate how they'll try to block our communications." At Mercury, Gavin's unconventional ideas about signal propagation initially met with resistance from traditionalists who saw little reason to modify techniques that had served since Marconi's day. But as German jamming became more sophisticated in the early war years, a few forward-thinking officers began to take notice of the young operator's theories about how slight modifications to transmission timing might help signals penetrate interference. "Hollister thinks differently," Morrison noted in his evaluation. "Most operators hear what's there. He somehow hears what isn't there, the spaces between signals that others miss." After completing his training with top marks in February 1940, Hollister expected to be assigned to a major warship. Instead, he found himself posted to the seemingly insignificant Dover Coastal Forces Station, coordinating communications for the small patrol craft that guarded the narrow waters of the English Channel. It appeared to be a disappointment, a backwater assignment while the real war was fought by capital ships in distant waters. What Hollister didn't know then was that he was being placed exactly where his unique talents would eventually save hundreds of lives. The narrow waters between England and occupied France would soon become one of the most contested and strategically vital regions of the entire naval war. And it was here that the limitations of conventional naval communications would be most severely tested. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for the men of the Channel Patrol. The Battle of the English Channel represented a critical front in the war against Nazi Germany. After the fall of France in June 1940, Hitler gained control of the entire French coastline from the Spanish border to Belgium. The Channel, once a secure British waterway, became a dangerous frontier, a narrow maritime border between Nazi-occupied Europe and the last major Allied power still fighting in the West. For Britain, maintaining control of these waters was existential. The Channel was both shield and sword, protecting the island nation from invasion, while providing a launching point for raids, intelligence operations, and eventually the liberation of Europe. But the geographical proximity to enemy territory created unique challenges. German radar installations at Calais could detect ship movements from Dover. E-boats, the fast German torpedo boats, could launch from French ports and strike British shipping within an hour. And most crucially for communications, German jamming stations along the French coast could directly target and disrupt Royal Navy radio transmissions. The British response was to establish the Dover Patrol, a collection of small, fast craft responsible for protecting convoys, sweeping mines, intercepting E-boat raids, and conducting their own offensive operations against German shipping. The patrol consisted of motor torpedo boats, MTBs, motor gunboats, MGBs, and converted trawlers, many of them civilian vessels pressed into military service and crewed by a combination of naval reservists and former fishermen. These small craft operated in groups of 4 to 6 vessels, conducting regular sweeps through assigned sectors, particularly focused on the narrowest part of the channel between Dover and Calais, just 21 miles of water that the Germans called Hellfire Corner for the intensity of combat that occurred there almost daily. By mid-1943, the strategic situation had grown increasingly complex. Allied shipping losses to U-boats were finally declining due to improved convoy tactics and air cover. But in the Channel, a different kind of battle raged. German E-boats, operating in wolf pack formations similar to their underwater counterparts, would strike suddenly from the fog or darkness, firing torpedoes at merchant vessels before speeding away. The Royal Navy's small patrol craft were the primary defense against these raids, but they faced a critical vulnerability: communications. Standard radio procedure required patrol vessels to maintain strict wireless silence, except for scheduled check-ins or emergency situations. This discipline prevented German direction-finding equipment from locating the patrol boats, but it also meant they operated in near isolation, dependent on pre-planned patrol routes and visual signaling that was useless in bad weather. Operational orders came from Dover Command, transmitted at specific times on designated frequencies. But by 1943, German jamming had become so effective that nearly 40% of these transmissions failed to reach their intended recipients. The tactical implications were severe. Patrol boats often continued outdated patrol patterns, unaware of reported E-boat movements or newly laid minefields. "Our men are sailing blind half the time," Buffet, Commander Douglas Everett, head of Dover Small Craft Operations, reported to the Admiralty in June 1943. By the time they receive updated intelligence, it's frequently too late to act upon it. We need a reliable communication method that the Germans cannot jam. The Admiralty's response was typically bureaucratic. A committee was formed to study alternative signaling methods, with recommendations expected within 3 months. But the men patrolling the Channel didn't have 3 months. They needed a solution immediately, as German raids increased with the improving summer weather. In the early hours of July 17, 1943, intelligence reports indicated that a significant force of E-boats had departed Boulogne, likely targeting a crucial supply convoy scheduled to pass through the Channel that morning. The convoy had been diverted to a northern route, but the 20 patrol boats of Flotilla 7, maintaining their regular patrol pattern in the heavy fog, had not received the updated warning. They were sailing directly into danger, and conventional means to alert them had failed. The tension in the Dover Communications Center built steadily as repeated attempts to contact the patrol vessels failed. Each transmission was met with the harsh, stuttering static of German jamming. The radar operator reported multiple fast-moving contacts emerging from the French coast, the distinctive signature of E-boats beginning their attack run. And somewhere in the fog, 20 British patrol boats continued their standard sweep, completely unaware of the danger bearing down on them. It was in this moment of escalating crisis that Petty Officer Gavin Hollister made a decision that would challenge every protocol in Royal Navy communications doctrine. "Sir, requesting permission to attempt non-standard transmission," Hollister said, his voice steady despite the stakes. Lieutenant Commander Farley turned from the plotting table, his expression grim. "The jamming's too heavy, Hollister. We've tried every authorized frequency." "Not this way, sir." Hollister's fingers hovered over his modified transmitter setup. "I've been developing a technique unofficially. It might cut through their jamming." Farley's eyes narrowed. "What technique? Why haven't you reported this through proper channels?" Hollister swallowed hard. 6 months of unsanctioned experiments conducted during quiet night watches flashed through his mind. The modifications he'd made to the transmitter, strictly against regulations. The alternative Morse timing pattern he'd developed through hundreds of hours of trial and error. All of it would likely end his naval career, possibly result in a court-martial. "It's called Shadow Morse, sir. It uses the spaces between jamming pulses rather than fighting against them. The Germans jam in predictable patterns. There are microseconds between their pulses where a signal can get through if properly timed." Farley glanced at the radar display showing the E-boats closing on the unsuspecting patrol craft. "That sounds theoretical at best, Hollister. Our men need real communication, not experiments." "It works, sir. I've tested it against our own jamming systems during training exercises." This wasn't entirely true. Hollister had conducted small tests, but nothing on this scale or under these conditions. The standard Morse timing is what they're jamming. If we alter the duration between elements, make the spaces between dots and dashes carry the information rather than the sounds themselves, their systems won't recognize it as a transmission worth blocking. Around them, the command center had grown quiet. The radar operator called out, "E-boats 5 miles from intercept, sir. 8 minutes maximum." Farley rubbed his forehead, the weight of 20 vessels and their crews hanging in the balance. Standard procedure dictated he should reject the untested, unauthorized method, but standard procedure offered no solution to the immediate crisis. "You understand what you're asking?" Farley said quietly. "If this fails, it's on both our heads. If it somehow interferes with other communications—" "It won't, sir. The method piggybacks on existing frequencies, but in the gaps their jammers create. It's like—" Hollister sought a metaphor the commander would understand. "It's like slipping through the shadow of their jamming rather than fighting the light." Farley held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Do it. Now." Hollister turned to his equipment, hands steady as he adjusted the settings on his modified transmitter. The standard Morse key felt heavy under his fingers as he began tapping out his message, but the pattern he used was unlike anything taught in naval communications schools. Where standard Morse relied on the duration of sounds, short dots and longer dashes, Hollister's shadow Morse inverted the paradigm. He transmitted in the briefest microsecond gaps between the German jamming pulses, using a mathematical pattern he'd developed to predict exactly when those gaps would occur. The actual sounds became almost irrelevant. It was their precise timing relative to the jamming that carried the information. To anyone monitoring the frequency, it would sound like nothing but the usual German interference, random static and crackling. But to a receiver calibrated to Hollister's specific timing pattern, a message would emerge from the noise hidden in plain hearing. The problem, of course, was that none of the patrol boats were equipped with receivers calibrated to this system. Hollister was counting on the exceptional skill of one man, Chief Petty Officer Martin Kearsley, the lead signalman on the command vessel HMS Wolfhound. Kearsley was known for his almost supernatural ability to detect patterns in noise, a talent that had previously saved his vessel during a nighttime encounter with E-boats. "Sending now," Hollister announced, his fingers dancing across the key in a rhythm that seemed random but followed a precise mathematical progression. For 60 agonizing seconds he repeated the same simple message: "Enemy approaching from south. Immediate evasive action required. Repeat, enemy approaching." In the command center, the tension was palpable. Radar showed the E-boats continuing their approach, now less than 4 miles from intercepting the patrol flotilla. The German vessels had slowed, moving more cautiously in the fog, a small mercy that bought precious minutes. "No acknowledgement," the radio man monitoring the patrol frequency reported. "They're not responding." "Keep transmitting," Farley ordered, his voice tight. Hollister continued, the muscles in his forearm burning with the strain of maintaining the precise, unnatural rhythm required by his shadow Morse technique. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. On the plotting table, the markers representing British and German vessels inched closer to convergence, 3 miles, 2.5. "Sir," the radar operator's voice cracked with sudden excitement. "The patrol boats are changing course. All units turning north in formation." Farley snatched up his binoculars, straining to see through the fog. Hollister paused in his transmission, flexing his cramped fingers. "They've heard us," he said quietly. Kearsley recognized the pattern. The command center erupted in a flurry of activity, as reports confirmed the patrol flotilla was indeed executing an emergency course change, moving rapidly away from the approaching E-boats. The German vessels, suddenly finding their intended targets, vanished into the fog, milled about in confusion before eventually returning to their French base, unwilling to pursue deeper into waters where RAF patrols might catch them exposed. 20 patrol boats and over 200 sailors had been saved from certain destruction by a communication technique that officially didn't exist. As the immediate danger passed, the enormity of what had occurred settled over the room. Hollister sat back from his equipment, suddenly aware that he had violated at least 6 different naval communications protocols. He had modified assigned equipment without authorization. He had transmitted using an unapproved method. He had potentially compromised operational security, and he had unquestionably saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. Lieutenant Commander Farley approached the young radio operator, his expression unreadable. "That was unorthodox, Petty Officer," he said quietly. "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility for—" "Write it down," Farley interrupted. "Every detail of how your method works, every modification you made to the equipment, every parameter of the timing sequence. He glanced around the command center, then lowered his voice. "This doesn't go in the official report. Not yet. But I want it documented. Sir, what you just did was either a stroke of genius or incredible luck. Either way, we may need it again." Farley's stern expression softened slightly. "The Admiralty takes a dim view of unauthorized modifications, Hollister, but they take an even dimmer view of losing 20 patrol boats without firing a shot." Hollister nodded slowly, understanding what wasn't being said. His actions would remain unofficial for now, but his shadow Morse had just become a secret weapon in the Battle of the English Channel. Neither man could have predicted how vital that weapon would prove in the months ahead, or how it would eventually transform naval communications doctrine throughout the Allied forces. The immediate aftermath of the July 17th incident unfolded in a manner characteristic of wartime naval operations, a curious blend of official silence and whispered revelation. No formal report mentioned Hollister's shadow Morse technique or its role in saving Flotilla 7 from destruction. The official action summary stated simply, "Patrol craft successfully evaded enemy contact due to timely intelligence transmission." Behind the scenes, however, a different story developed. Lieutenant Commander Farley, recognizing both the potential and the risk of Hollister's innovation, established what he called specialized communication protocols for the Dover patrol groups. Within 72 hours, Hollister found himself withdrawn from regular duties and installed in a small windowless room at the rear of the communications center, surrounded by modified radio equipment and a hand-picked team of 3 other operators. Their mission, never formally documented in writing, was to refine and expand the Shadow Morse system for operational use. Chief Petty Officer Kearsley from HMS Wolfhound was temporarily assigned to the team, his intuitive understanding of the technique proving invaluable in developing training methods for other operators. "You're hearing the silence between the noise," Kearsley explained to the others, struggling to articulate what his ears perceived instinctively. "It's like counting the spaces between waves rather than the waves themselves." The technical challenges were substantial. Standard naval radio equipment wasn't designed for the microsecond precision required by Hollister's method. Each transmitter and receiver had to be individually modified. Delicate adjustments to timing circuits, custom-built frequency filters, specialized calibration procedures that took hours to perfect. Within 2 weeks, 6 patrol vessels had been equipped with modified receivers and trained operators. The system remained strictly unofficial, its very existence known only to those directly involved and a select few in Dover Command. No written orders ever mentioned Shadow Morse. The technique was transmitted verbally to trusted officers, always with the understanding that official channels would attribute any successful communications to improved signal discipline or fortunate atmospheric conditions. The first operational test came on August 3, 1943, when a German jamming station near Calais activated during a planned mine-laying operation by British forces. Standard communications were completely blocked, but Shadow Morse transmissions cut through with approximately 70% clarity, enough to coordinate the mission successfully. 3 weeks later, during an engagement with E-boats off Dunkirk, the system performed flawlessly, allowing coordinated maneuvers that resulted in 2 enemy vessels sunk and another damaged. Word spread quietly through the Channel forces, unofficial, unacknowledged, but increasingly relied upon. Commanders requested Hollister-trained radio operators for critical missions. Patrol boat captains began checking if their vessels were shadow-capable before departing Dover Harbor. Yet as the system proved its worth, Hollister himself wrestled with conflicting emotions. Pride in his creation was tempered by frustration at its unofficial status and concern over its limitations. The technique required exceptional skill from operators on both ends of the transmission. It worked brilliantly against German jamming, but struggled with natural interference from weather conditions. And most worryingly, Hollister detected subtle changes in German jamming patterns that suggested they might be attempting to analyze and counter the new method. "They know something's happening," he reported to Farley in late September. "Their jamming pulses are becoming less predictable. They're trying different patterns, testing for responses." The constant pressure took its toll. Hollister worked 18-hour days, dividing his time between operational support for patrol missions and continued refinement of the shadow Morse technique. His health suffered. He lost weight, developed persistent headaches, and found himself unable to sleep without the background static of a radio receiver, his mind constantly processing patterns in the noise. The situation came to a head in November 1943, when Admiralty representatives arrived unexpectedly at Dover Command. Rumours had eventually reached London of an unauthorised communication system being employed in Channel operations. An investigation team led by Captain Edmund Hartwell, a signals specialist from Naval Intelligence, demanded a full briefing on what they termed communications irregularities. Lieutenant Commander Farley, to his credit, took full responsibility for authorising the system. "If there's to be disciplinary action, sir, it should fall on me alone," he told Hartwell during their initial meeting. "Petty Officer Hollister developed the technique, but I sanctioned its use without proper authorization." Hartwell's response was unexpected. Rather than initiating disciplinary proceedings, he requested a comprehensive demonstration of shadow Morse in action. For 2 days, Hollister and his team operated under intense scrutiny, explaining the technical principles, demonstrating the equipment modifications, and running live tests against simulated German jamming. On the 3rd day, Hartwell delivered his assessment. "What you've created here," he told Hollister privately, "represents the kind of adaptive thinking this war demands. Officially, I should shut it down immediately for violating at least a dozen communications protocols." He paused, studying the young radio operator carefully. "Unofficially, I'm going to ensure it receives the development resources it deserves, under appropriate supervision, of course." Within a week, Hollister found himself transferred to a classified signals research facility near Portsmouth, his equipment and notes carefully packed and transported under armed guard. The Shadow Morse system was about to transition from unauthorized improvisation to official, albeit secret, naval communication doctrine. What Hollister didn't know was that his technique had already saved far more than 20 patrol boats. By the time he left Dover, his system had been used in over 60 operational engagements, contributing to the protection of thousands of sailors and dozens of vital convoys. And its greatest contributions to the Allied war effort still lay ahead. For Gavin Hollister, the remainder of the war unfolded in unexpected directions. His transfer to the Signals Research Facility at HMS Mercury marked the beginning of a new phase in both his career and in the development of Allied communication technology. The small, unmarked building where he was installed was designated simply as Special Communications Research Unit and housed an eclectic collection of academics, engineers, and experienced radio operators, all working on classified projects to counter German electronic warfare capabilities. Under this official umbrella, Shadow Morse evolved rapidly. The improvised modifications Hollister had made to Dover's equipment were refined by professional engineers into standardized kits that could be installed on any naval radio set. The mathematical timing patterns he had developed intuitively were analyzed by Oxford mathematicians, who created algorithms to predict and counter changing enemy jamming techniques. Most significantly, the requirement for exceptional operator skill was reduced through the development of specialized receiving equipment that automatically synchronized with the transmission pattern. By February 1944, the system, now officially designated Pattern Adaptive Signal Transmission, or PAST to obscure its true nature, was being deployed beyond the Channel. Convoy escorts in the North Atlantic, Mediterranean forces supporting operations in Italy, and even Pacific Fleet units all received the technology, though few understood its origins as the desperate improvisation of a single radio operator in Dover. Hollister himself remained largely anonymous outside the small circle of signals intelligence specialists. His contributions earned him promotion to Chief Petty Officer and the Distinguished Service Medal, presented in a private ceremony with no press coverage. The citation mentioned only exceptional technical innovation in communications under combat conditions. When the war ended in 1945, Hollister faced the same question confronting millions of servicemen. What now? The classified nature of his work limited his ability to translate his expertise directly to civilian employment. Most commercial radio operations had no need for the specialized techniques he had pioneered, and he couldn't discuss the details of his most significant achievement. He briefly considered remaining in the Royal Navy, where he had been offered a commission as a signals officer, but the rigid hierarchy and bureaucracy that had initially resisted his innovations held little appeal. Instead, he accepted a position with the newly formed Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, the peacetime successor to Bletchley Park's Signals Intelligence Operations. At GCHQ, Hollister's experience with adaptive transmission techniques proved valuable in the emerging Cold War environment, where Soviet jamming presented challenges similar to those he had faced against the Germans. For nearly 30 years, he worked quietly in various technical roles, his wartime innovations forming the foundation for increasingly sophisticated electronic countermeasures. He married in 1947 Margaret Wilson, a former Wren who had served as a radio operator at Portsmouth during the war. They settled in a modest home in Cheltenham, raised 2 children, and lived what appeared to be an entirely unremarkable life. Few of their neighbors ever knew of Gavin's crucial wartime role or his ongoing classified work. Even as his health began to fail in the 1970s, the full story of Shadow Morse remained largely undocumented in official histories. The technique had evolved into more advanced systems, its origins obscured by layers of classification and institutional memory loss. Hollister himself, bound by the Official Secrets Act, spoke little of his wartime experiences, even to family. It wasn't until 1982, as Cold War tensions drove renewed interest in communication security, that the first partially declassified accounts of Shadow Morse appeared in specialized military journals. A brief article in the Royal Signals Quarterly titled "Adaptive Transmission Techniques, Historical Foundations" mentioned Hollister by name and acknowledged the Dover origin of the technology that had by then evolved into sophisticated frequency hopping systems used throughout NATO. This limited recognition led to a few interviews with military historians and a modest ceremony at the Imperial War Museum, where Hollister, then in his 60s and battling heart disease, was finally able to see some of his original equipment on display. Though much of the explanatory text remained deliberately vague about its significance, perhaps more meaningful to Hollister were the letters that occasionally found their way to him from former Channel Patrol veterans. Though few understood the technical details of how his system had worked, many remembered the critical moments when Shadow Morse transmissions had warned them of approaching E-boats or directed them safely through minefields. "I served on MTB 117 from 43 to 45, one letter began. Our skipper told us once that the ghost signals saved our lives at least 3 times. I never knew what he meant until I read about your work last month. My son and his children exist because of what you did. Thank you doesn't seem enough, but it's all I have to offer." Hollister kept these letters in a folder, separate from his official papers and recognition. They represented, he told his wife, the only history that really matters. When Gavin Hollister died in October 1987, his obituary in the Times mentioned his war service only briefly, noting that he had been involved in the development of specialized naval communication systems. The full impact of his innovation, the thousands of lives saved, the critical operations enabled, remained largely hidden behind the veil of official secrecy that had characterized both his wartime and post-war careers. Yet within the specialized world of military communications, his legacy lived on. The principles he pioneered during those desperate days in Dover evolved into the frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technologies that form the backbone of secure military communications to this day. Modern systems like SINS-GARS, Single-Channel Ground and Airborne Radio System, and HAVQUIC, used by NATO forces worldwide, are direct descendants of the improvised technique a young radio operator developed to save 20 patrol boats in the fog-shrouded waters of the English Channel. In 1993, 6 years after Hollister's death, the full technical details of Shadow Morse were finally declassified as part of a broader release of World War II signals intelligence materials. Communications engineers and military historians were at last able to appreciate the elegance and innovation of Hollister's solution, all the more remarkable for having been developed under combat conditions with limited resources by a non-academic practitioner. A small plaque was added to the Dover Castle Museum exhibition on Coastal Forces operations. It reads simply, "In memory of Chief Petty Officer Gavin Hollister, whose technical innovation saved countless lives in the waters below this cliff. He heard what others could not." In the decades since World War II, the nature of military communication has transformed almost beyond recognition. Digital encryption, satellite transmission, advanced spectrum management technologies all have replaced the comparatively primitive systems used by both sides during the 1940s. The modern sailor or soldier communicates through secure networks that automatically adapt to jamming and interference, switching frequencies and encoding methods without human intervention. Yet for all their sophistication, these systems still operate on principles first demonstrated by Gavin Hollister's shadow Morse. The fundamental insight that the spaces between signals can carry as much information as the signals themselves, that patterns perceived as noise by one listener may contain vital messages for another, that the most effective counter to an enemy's electronic warfare isn't necessarily more power but more adaptability. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Hollister's legacy isn't technological, but human. The reminder that in warfare's most critical moments, doctrine and protocol must sometimes yield to innovation and intuition. Faced with an impossible situation, standing in a cliff-top radio station, watching disaster approach, he chose to violate the rules he had sworn to uphold because he recognized a higher duty to the lives at stake. The 20 patrol boats saved that July morning in 1943 were just the beginning. By war's end, the system Hollister pioneered had contributed to the protection of hundreds of vessels and thousands of sailors, had enabled vital intelligence communications during the D-Day landings, had helped coordinate the complex naval operations supporting the Allied advance through Europe, all from a technique that officially never existed. Military historians often focus on the grand strategies, the major battles, the technological breakthroughs that clearly demarcated before and after. But warfare is also decided in countless small moments of crisis, when one person makes a decision that ripples outward in ways they cannot possibly anticipate, when rules are broken in service to principles, when intuition pierces through the fog of war. Standing in that Dover radio station, watching German E-boats bearing down on unsuspecting patrol craft, Petty Officer Gavin Hollister had no way of knowing that his improvised solution would evolve into communication systems still protecting military forces 80 years later. He saw only the immediate problem: 20 boats, 200 men, and radio waves filled with jamming. His solution, elegant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its implications, reminds us that technological innovation often emerges not from comfortable research laboratories, but from desperate necessity on the front lines. Shadow Morse began as one man's unauthorized experiment, became a classified tactical advantage, and eventually transformed into doctrinal foundation, all because in that moment of crisis, Hollister refused to accept that communication was impossible. The men aboard those patrol boats never heard the actual transmission that saved their lives. They perceived only the pattern hidden within the noise, the signal within the jamming, the message in the shadow of the enemy's electronic assault. In that paradox lies perhaps the most fitting metaphor for Hollister's contribution to the Allied victory. Sometimes the most powerful messages are those we don't hear directly, but somehow understand nonetheless. Would you have broken the rules as Hollister did? Violated communications protocols, modified equipment without authorization, implemented an untested technique during active combat operations? Would you have accepted the professional risk, the potential court-martial, the career-ending consequences of failure? Or would you have adhered to doctrine and procedure, even knowing the likely cost in lives? These questions have no simple answers. They remind us that warfare exists at the intersection of technology and humanity, of rules and judgment, of protocol and initiative. They challenge us to consider where our own breaking points might lie, the moments when we would choose to step beyond authorized boundaries in service to a greater purpose. Gavin Hollister's story deserves to be remembered not just as a technological milestone but as a human one, a testament to the power of individual initiative in history's darkest hours. When official channels failed, when standard procedures proved inadequate. When lives hung in the balance, one radio operator's willingness to think differently made all the difference. Share this story so others remember what courage really means, not just the physical bravery of those who faced enemy fire in the Channel waters, but the moral courage of those who dared to challenge established thinking when lives depended on it.